Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone. I'm certainly delighted to be here. It's a privilege to speak to the TC community, to students, former students, and friends and everyone else. So I'm really happy to be here to give this lecture. I remember very fondly the presentations I made at TC many years ago as part of the Apple lecture series. So thank you to the student group for inviting me, and thank you all for spending what's probably your last working day for the year listening to my talk. I'm going to start sharing my screen now so that I can get on with it. Okay, does it look okay? Okay, all right. So while thinking about the topic, I wanted to give it a certain focus because otherwise the topic of language assessment for immigration and citizenship is far too wide and too difficult to handle in a 45-minute lecture. Anyone would need many hours to untangle many aspects of this topic. So in thinking of how to talk about it, I decided to talk about the historiography of US immigration, citizenship, and language policy. I will explain some of the terms I'm using so that it's not unfamiliar. One of the biggest stories, you may know, in the last 10 years or the last 20 years has been global migration. It's a story of, in Europe, with the wave of immigrants from different parts of Europe to Western Europe. It's a story of refugees seeking asylum or refugee status in Western Europe, in the United States, and in many other parts of the world. India, for example, for people from Bangladesh, Thailand, and other places for refugees from Myanmar, and so on. So the story is a global story, and the World Economic Forum indicates that as of 2019, there were 271 million migrants who are moving around from one part of the world to another part of the world. The number is historic. As you can see, the 3.5% of the world's population has been moving or has moved, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight simply because of the plight of the residents in some countries, and they move for various reasons. So I'll come to that, but just look at these staggering numbers from even 20 years ago. In the year 2000, there were 173 million, but now there are 100 more million migrants. Now, who are immigrants or migrants? Well, we can categorize them as follows. Involuntary immigrants in search of asylum or refugee status, and voluntary immigrants in search of better work opportunities for temporary residence based on work or study and for reunification. They may have dual identities or multiple identities. They may be transnational. They could be short-term tourists or students, or they could be long-term work permit holders, family reunification, and immigrants into a country seeking long residence and perhaps citizenship. In most countries, immigrants can apply for citizenship in the receiving country after 3 or 5 years of residence, of legal residence. But at the end of it, when they apply, it turns out that they have to pass tests, typically in the national language of the country. And of course, it's in the standard dialect of the national language. You may also need to have to pass a history and civics exam, or take part in cultural integration, acculturation classes. So there's a whole lot of things that an immigrant has to do to become a citizen. And this is not obvious to most citizens. You see, so the citizens often think that the residents in a country can become a citizen very quickly. In fact, this happened to me many decades ago. Friends of mine, colleagues of mine said, you're a citizen, right? I said, no, it's not that easy to. Why? He was perplexed. He said, well, you just put in some paperwork and you get it in a few weeks. I said, no, that is not the case. And so most citizens in a country may not know the maybe called the convoluted policies and practices that require an immigrant to follow in order to become a citizen. Two former students of mine and I reviewed 61 countries, and we found the following. For citizenship, 33 countries require a pass at the level of A1 to B1 in the CEFR level of language proficiency in the receiving country's standard variety. So this is a global phenomenon, as you can see. It's probably wider than 61 countries. We haven't been able to review all the countries listed in the United Nations because many countries don't have websites that are very clearly outline their policies. For immigration, 12 countries needed some kind of language requirement. And for asylum or refugee status, as of today, no countries need any language requirements, although countries try to determine the origin of the residents by using language. So what has been famously called LADO, language assessment for determination of origin of the residents, especially if you pass through a second country and you come into a third country. So governments may want to know whether you belong to country 1 or country 2. And typically that's done by an interview process, and which is also problematic. In 53 of the 61 countries, there's a single language requirement. That means that you've got to master, to some extent, at least maybe A1, A2, B1, or B1 at least, of the standard language, standard variety of the country's language, national language, official language, whatever the case may be. There are some exceptions. Belgium, Bosnia, Canada, India, Myanmar, Singapore, Taiwan, and the Netherlands, in this set of 61 countries, requires proficiency in maybe 2 or 3 or 4 languages. Just to give you an example, in the case of Singapore, it's any one of the 4 languages of Singapore. The official languages are Bahasa Melayu, Mandarin, Tamil, and English. In India, it's English, Hindi, and any one of the 22 official languages of all of the states. So different countries have different policies. In Canada, for example, has English and French. So there is some understanding of multilingualism in those countries. But as you can see, most of them don't have such a policy. Their policy is monolingual. Some countries may also include elements such as ability to culturally integrate with the dominant culture. So you may have to go through some cultural training or acculturation classes. Also have to know something about the national civics, history, and government of the country. And in one case, you'll have to be able to sing the national anthem, and that's the country of South Korea. Now, you can see how complex all of this is when immigration officers worldwide are not trained typically in any form of language assessment or even language pedagogy or knowledge of history or civics or the national anthem or singing of the national anthem. But they're on the books, and this is what immigrants have to be able to do in order to get citizenship. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the title, the term that I've used in my title, historiography. Historiography is the way history has been and continues to be written. And for this talk, I think it was important for me to give this framework to every one of you so that you understand the way I'm approaching this topic. There are two kinds of histories, if you like. Typically, elitist histories are credited to colonialists or neo-colonialists during the time of colonies, and unfortunately, there are still a few colonies around the world, or bourgeois nationalists or neo-nationalists. Typically, such histories focus on kings and queens and governor generals, presidents, prime ministers, other administrators, or missionaries, landlords, moneylenders. The history of the country is their personalities, their policies, and their institutions, their activities, ideas, and achievements. And that's typically called the official history. It's not only the official history, it's the universalist history of that country or of that region. So that becomes the history of the country. And this is typically the history most students study in school and college, unless you have an enlightened school district. And the official colonial history, in the case of colonial times, was brought about a glorification of empire, how they brought about justice and social progress for all, and mainly the history is triumphalist in tone. The unhistorical, so-called unhistorical histories are the histories like subaltern histories, a term used by Antonio Gramsci in 1931. He talked about the cultural hegemony that excludes and displaces people in order to deny agency and voice. This was written in his prison notebooks in the 1930s. And this was picked up by South Asian scholars who interrogated the official history of British India, and led by Ranajit Guha, a collective of subaltern historians, collected their ideas and worked on a variety of subaltern histories of South Asia. They originated typically, in the first instance, they originated from the Australian National University in Canberra. Subaltern histories are histories told from below, the politics and activities of marginalized people, the self-representation of their history. And that's what is important. In post-colonial studies, the subalterns were oppressed classes, typically rural, peasant revolutionaries, or Dalits. In modern times, in my view, it's the immigrant who's displaced and marginalized in countries where they arrive. They are the subalterns, the modern subalterns. Immigrants have escaped persecution or seek employment or reuniting with families or hoping for refugee status. And they are the ones who lose their languages, their cultures, ways of knowing and being, and agency and authority. And in this context, I'd like to point out that if you look at the histories of colonization, all the countries that colonized never lost their language or culture, whether it was Britain, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Belgium, France, none of them lost their languages. The people who were colonizers did not lose French, did not lose English, did not lose German, but in many cases, the local people lost their languages, or their languages were suppressed to the extent that they had to rediscover the languages after independence from colonizers in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So great harm is done by colonizing forces in terms of the first language of the colonized people. So I'd like now to tell the story, the nationalist story of immigration and citizenship in the United States. Here's how the story begins. Now, 1783, George Washington proclaimed, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respected stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges." And the Constitution a few years later gave Congress the right to adopt naturalization laws that will grant citizenship to immigrants. So very open and powerful statements by Washington and action by Congress. So in 1790, we have the Naturalization Act, which stated that any alien who was a free white person and who had resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for a term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen on application to any common law court of record in any one of the states where he had resided for a term of 1 year, making proof to the satisfaction of the court that he's a person of good character and taking the oath of affirmation prescribed by law to support the Constitution of the United States. So with the passing of the 13th Amendment, though, it took a while from 1790 to 1868, Blacks or African Americans were recognized as citizens. So it took that long for African Americans to get citizenship. And the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people, and provided all citizens with equal protection under the laws. So this is the official story, right? It's a nationalist story. But it took till 1924 for Native Americans who were native to the country to be granted citizenship. Now, it's just look at the situation here. You have colonizers who come to a country and then declare themselves to be the government, and they did not give citizenship to African Americans who were brought as slaves generally, and Native Americans for the longest time. But the Immigration Act of 1924 also brought new restrictions on immigration through a numerical limit of 155,000, typically in the form of a quota. The Western Europeans got 87%, Eastern and Southern Europeans got 11%. So this act hardened the lines between whites and non-whites. Now, fast forward to 1952. This is the most important act that has been passed regarding immigration and naturalization, because it's stipulated that these two conditions must be met by immigrants who seek citizenship. The first one is an understanding of the English language, including an ability to read, write, and speak words in ordinary usage in the English language. And two, a knowledge and understanding of the fundamentals of the history and of the principles and form of government of the United States. So two requirements, and we'll see these two requirements operationalized in the way it is today. Let's see, this tries and open. It's not opening. Okay, I show you this one. If you look at the number of foreign born in the United States, you see that in 1960, on the left, you have more males than females. But as you go to the right, in 2018, there are more females than males. Also, the bulge in terms of the age of immigrants and age of foreign born, you'll see is different. So there were more foreign born older immigrants in the 1960s, but today that group has come down in age. If you look at this pie chart, this gives you a sense of number of citizens in the United States who are naturalized. That's 20.7 million. And lawful permanent residents, 12.3 million. And so-called unauthorized immigrants, 10.5, and temporary lawful residents, 2.2. The interest for us is to look at naturalized citizens, or 21 million roughly, and lawful permanent residents, who are about 12.5 million. I'd like to now look at what I call the undertold story of immigration and citizenship. And I want to show you some debates in Congress. The first one was when Presidents Cleveland, Taft, and Wilson vetoed the literacy bill, which was the start of interest in Congress regarding a language proficiency stipulation. In 1897, Cleveland vetoed the literacy bill. Taft vetoed it in 1913. Wilson vetoed it in 1915, but was overridden by Congress. And the debate from one side said literacy tests will deter poorly educated immigrants from entering the United States. Henry Cabot. Public use of all foreign languages should be banned, said the governor of Iowa. And there is no relation between literacy and good moral character, said Stevenson in the 59th Congress. But the language policy of America was stoutly monolingual, at least wanted to be. American employers promoted monolingualism, and Presidents Wilson and Roosevelt supported them too. Wilson, during his presidency, 1913 to 21, said, "You cannot become thorough Americans if you think yourselves in groups. America does not consist of groups. A man who thinks of himself as belonging to a particular national group in America has not yet become American." Roosevelt said, "We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language, for we intend to see that the crucible turns our people out as Americans of American nationality, and not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is the loyalty to the American people." There were court rulings too regarding the use of foreign languages in schools, in primary schools. In 1923, 22 states had laws prohibiting the teaching of foreign languages. It was only after the Supreme Court ruled in Mayer versus Nebraska that teaching a foreign language, that teaching in a foreign language was unconstitutional. But Farrington and Tokusigi ruled that efforts to abolish private Japanese, Korean, Chinese language schools was unconstitutional. And Lau versus Nichols ruled that the lack of supplemental language instruction in public schools violated the Civil Rights Act of 1924. So what I wanted to show you in these slides is the debates in Congress, the proclamations or statements by presidents, and court rulings, how they combined in some way to keep the idea of a monolingual English country. And this brings us to the literacy test of 1917. The whole purpose was to restrict immigration by imposing literacy tests on immigrants, creating a new category of inadmissible persons. You could be inadmissible if you had disease, if you didn't have the right papers, and so on and so forth. But literacy was yet another new category introduced. It also barred immigrants from the Asia-Pacific zone. Here's a cartoon from a newspaper which shows America as the land of the free with a huge wall, and the wall is the literacy test. Literacy tests were typically operationalized in the form of literacy test cards in multiple languages. Here's an example. I have examples from Italian, Armenian, Turkish, and Hebrew. So if you're an immigrant and you arrived in the 1930s in the United States, you would be given a card of your choice. If you said you were Italian, you'd be given the Italian card, and you were expected to be able to read the Italian or the English. I'm not sure how proficient you had to be or how accurate you had to be, because immigration officers really did not have any training in this matter. However, this was one of the ways it was enforced. And here's an immigrant screening sort of question which was used, set of questions. This was called the New York State Regents Literacy Test. And to confuse the matter even a little further, literacy tests in the South, for example, were also used for voting. So in order to get the right to vote, you had to prove that you were literate. So here you had to show that you were not diseased or disabled. You had to pass the literacy test. You were supposed to be able to prove that you were able to work and have at least $25. in 1882, after a series of restrictive sort of prohibitions in California, Chinese immigrants or Chinese residents who had worked successfully in gold mines in California and on the railroad operations linking the West with the East, they became less useful in the late 1880s, and the Chinese Exclusion Act suspended immigration of Chinese laborers to the US for 10 years. It prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens through the naturalization process. And the act was only repealed in 1943. And here's a cartoon which shows persons to be excluded. It says the Golden Gate of Liberty: communists, nihilists, socialist, Fenian, hoodlum, welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. Such restrictions were not uncommon. Mexican and Mexican Americans saw the brunt of mass deportation after the Great Depression. And by the end of the Great Depression, the United States had turned into a deportation nation that made no distinction between foreign-born and the undocumented. Here's a photograph from the La Opinion in Los Angeles, which shows hundreds of people lining up at the Los Angeles train station who were either Mexican or Mexican American, and they were so-called repatriated to Mexico. And the cartoon on the right says, you look like Mexicans. And there are people who say, but we were born here, we're Americans. Such restrictions continued, as you can see, with Roosevelt signing the Executive Order 6066, which authorized incarceration of Japanese Americans, German Americans, and Italian Americans in US concentration camps during the Second World War. But the brunt of this order was felt by Japanese Americans. 120,000 of them were interned in 10 relocation centers in California, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Arkansas until 1944, when the US Supreme Court ruled that loyal citizens of the United States, regardless of cultural descent, could not be detained without cause. There's a well-known center in Manzanar, which is on the eastern part of California, on the way to Las Vegas. And there is a plaque and there is a small museum dedicated to the whole event. Here's a poster that was common in the 1940s, 1942 onwards, that indicated what people of Japanese descent had to do. Now, I've given you examples of how the United States has restricted people, either in terms of immigration or in terms of citizenship. But it also has another angle, and that is the angle of welcoming immigrants. And we've seen this for decades, in fact, for 100 years more. Jewish immigration, South Korean immigration, Vietnamese refugees, the Mariel boat lift from Cuba, Central American immigrants, US amnesty for all immigrants, legal permanent residency status for all Chinese residents after the post-Tiananmen Square incident, Immigration Act of 1990, which increased the annual immigration and refugee total to 700,000, and employment visas going from 54,000 to 140,000. And then most recently, refugees from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. So it's got this strange behavior of restricting and welcoming. And the Welcoming Act is typically seen as a benign act in support of liberal values, forgetting, of course, what perhaps might have caused the action, the situation in the first place. Here's a photograph of Vietnamese refugees in 1975 on a boat. These were one of the refugee boats. Here's an example of the Mariel boat lift from Cuba in 1980. We'll now have a look at naturalization itself. And this is the official naturalization story, which says that if you want to become a citizen through naturalization, you have to follow certain steps. One is a minimum requirement of continuous stay for 5 years if you come here as a resident. If you are married to an American citizen, I think it's 3 years. And if you have refugee status, it's 3 years. So there are some variations, but generally between 3 and 5 years. You fill out forms, you pay fees, all that, and then you take the test. That's the big thing. You take the English language test and the history and civics test, and if all your paperwork is fine, then you get a notice to take the oath of allegiance at the ceremony, and your citizenship is granted to you. Many of you may know the requirements of the naturalization test, but I'll repeat it quickly. For the English test, applicants have to answer questions in English during the interview, and this forms the listening and speaking part. So as you are welcomed into the office, the immigration officer will start talking to you in English, start talking to the immigrant in English, and the immigrant is expected to respond. But these could be very simple interactions like how you're doing, have a seat, are you comfortable, and things like that. Or it could even, anecdotally, I have heard from former students who talked about their parents and grandparents being asked questions like, so what did you think of the Dodger game last night? And the immigration officer expects a response to that. So there's all kinds of cultural things going on here that is unwritten in the simple interaction between the immigration officer and the applicant for citizenship, which is couched as a part of the listening and speaking test. Then we have the reading, which is the reading of a sentence from 100 sentences, or a combination of words which make 100 sentences, which an applicant is supposed to be able to read. So just read aloud. They're given 3 chances to read aloud, and they have to get at least one sentence read correctly. Now, there are very few clear guidelines regarding this. What constitutes a pass? What constitutes a fail? If you miss a word or a phrase, what is salient in a sentence? This is unclear. And a similar test is in the writing part. You have applicants who will be given 3 sentences, and they're expected to write 1 sentence clearly. Now, I've recorded sentences that have been asked in the past. It could be as simple as, today is a beautiful day. I have a car. I live in a home. I came to the office half an hour earlier. Or it could be the President of the United States lives in Washington, D.C., which is a longer sentence and may require an understanding of how to spell the bigger words, names of places, and so on. So once that is over and the immigration officer is satisfied you've passed the English test, then they will move on to the civics test. But if you've not passed the English test, you will be stopped there, and they will discontinue your application and ask you to come back. So you're given another chance to pass the English test. The same is true of the history and civics test. You'd be given 2 chances. So if you fail the first time, you'd be given a chance to come back without an extra fee and without any additional processing. So for the civics test, you have to answer 6 out of 10 questions correctly. There are 100 questions. These are questions that were listed just as a list, but most recently they've been placed into categories like democracy, government, and so on, so that applicants can, learn these things in context. But they still require a significant amount of memory and recall. And so this is quite problematic in itself. And once again, in this whole operation, we can question the validity, we can question the reliability and the meaningfulness and so on. So I will do that shortly. The US agencies responsible for citizenship, which is the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, as well as other outfits from the Department of Justice and advocacy groups, have prepared lots of materials that are useful in the process for immigrants, such as handbooks, flashcards, materials on websites, YouTube videos, all of these things, so that the process is clearer than it looks. Let's look at some data from the last few years. These are data from Department of Homeland Security. I'd like you to have a look at the last line, 2019, 830,560 applicants filed papers. The persons naturalized were 843,593. That's not an error, the 843. It's 843,593 who were approved for naturalization in 2019. But you know, it's based on the calendar year, and in some cases, if you apply in the latter part of the year, by the time you get approved, it may be the following year. So typically, I'm told nowadays the process takes at least a year. But what's important to note is that 97,789 people were denied going forward to get their citizenship. So the denial percentage has gone up. It's gone to 11.77. So these are all legal residents. And the question is, why would you want to restrict people this way? Quick note on where these applicants are from. Out of the 843,593 for 2019, 122,000 were from Mexico, 64,000 from India, 39,000 from China, 43 from Philippines, Dominican Republic, and Cuba make the last two. These are the top six. Basically, there are individuals from every country in the world applying for US citizenship. So the numbers are staggering. I mean, to process 800,000 or 900,000 applications a year face-to-face is a challenge. They don't want to use a test of any kind that is commercially available or online or through a mobile device. The test has to be done in person, and this is a result of the corruption that was in place during a 5 or 10 year period when these tests were farmed out to, I don't know what to call them, organizations, if you like, institutions that were part of advocacy groups, as well as commercial groups. The area of residence, most of them live in the New York, Newark area, although those numbers, percentages are coming down from 15.8 to 12.8. Miami, Fort Lauderdale is 7%, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim is 6.7, coming down there again from 8.4, and so on. The biggest increase, as you can see, is in Texas, both in Houston and in Dallas, in the Houston area and the Dallas area. Person naturalized by state of residence is still California, 17.6%. It's come down. Texas is on its way up. Now, this is a slide that I want you to have a look at a little carefully. Persons naturalizing in 2019 spent a median of 8 years in legal permanent resident status before becoming US citizens. And the breakdown is as follows. For residents from Africa, it was 6 years, which is quick, which means, if you were eligible to apply at the end of 5, Residents from Africa applied quickly, Asia less quickly, South America even more slowly, and Europe and Oceania and North America was 10 years, and North America by itself was 10 years. So residents from some countries are taking longer to apply. Now, if you look at the test itself, I've done different kinds of analyses on the test with the data that we have, the so-called data. There's total positive data because no data is available from immigration services regarding the number of people who fail the different parts. We don't know who fails where, and whether it's English or history. And we don't know which part of the English is causing the most difficulty. So there is no data available from USCIS regarding these matters. So all we have are practice tests and videos and other materials that are available, and some documentation these days written up by perhaps people from the State Department or the Department of Justice. Now, so to answer the question, do applicants have an opportunity to learn for the test? Well, yes, they kind of moderately do, because the test is publicized well. It's available on the website, lots of information and so on. You can also go to community colleges to take classes that are specific to ESL and citizenship. So that is quite inexpensive. It's about $50 in California. You can also go to advocacy or community centers where the service might be free. The pass rate for the test, as you can see, is about 90% from March to August 2019. But at the same time, there are about 97,000 people who sort of failed the process. We don't know exactly what they failed, as I said before. We don't know whether they failed the English part or the history part or some other part, where things like paperwork, documentation, records, a record of stay in the United States. So I would say that the OTL, opportunity to learn, for the test is moderate. If you think about the meaningfulness of the test to the test taker, now you wonder what it is that is being tested. In terms of the CFR levels, if you look, the test is at like an A1, I think, for listening and speaking, and maybe an A2 for reading and writing. So that's where the level is. And the test is done through three questions, if you like. 3 for reading, 3 for writing. Is that enough, or should there be more? Is it too many already? These are questions that we have to ask. And the history and civics, on the other hand, requires memory of information with 100 questions, 100 questions. So the questions can be as simple as, where does the President of the United States live? As though that's an important thing to remember, right? It can also be, when was the Constitution written? Who wrote the Constitution? Who were the people responsible? And because there were a lot of criticisms about the test itself in terms of memorization, they like to ask questions these days regarding concepts, like, what is the meaning of democracy for you? So you're supposed to say, it allows me to vote. I have the opportunity to participate in governance, things like that. But this is much more difficult, for people with limited English language ability. 80 to 90% of the applicants for citizenship are non-English first language speakers. So they are second language, third language, fourth language speakers. And many of them are, as you know, more than 30 or 40 or 50 years old. So it's likely that they were in the country, they came to the United States without much English language instruction. And their proficiency probably was low at that time. They sought employment and did not have the opportunity to take part in any English language instruction. So this becomes difficult. So I would say in terms of meaningfulness, it's inconsistent. In terms of item difficulty, we don't know what the item difficulties are. And some of the items definitely are more difficult than others. Is the test absent in terms of bias? Absolutely not clear, because the applicants are administered items with the same level of difficulty, we are told, to both English test and history and civics tests, but it's at the discretion of the immigration officers. So there could be unintended bias if the immigration officer was just not focusing, but we have no data to support it this way or that way, you know. So it's likely that there is bias, but maybe there is no bias. But there could be a cause for bias because of the range of questions. If you have 100 questions for civics and history, some of them are definitely easier than others. Is there a range that everyone gets with the 10 questions? They get 10 questions. Are they all sort of evenly spread out into easy, medium, and high difficulty? We don't know that. And that's not something that USCIS makes known. So bias cannot be ruled out. In terms of accommodations and access to the test, now this is a really serious problem. The filing fee, $640 for the form, N400 form, and $85 for the biometric fee was the standard fee. It was reduced to $320 and $85 if the applicant documented annual household income that's not more than 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. But 4 years ago, Congress, with the President Trump's administration, increased the fee to $1,170 per application. That is no typo, $1,170 with no reduced fee. So, you know, in terms of accommodations, they do have some accommodations for people who have lived here for long, and for, you know, in terms of accommodations for medical disabilities, you can have a sign language expert, you can have an in-person scribe, and so on. But in terms of access to the test, I would say this is low because the fee is way too high. So in terms of consequences, the petitions filed for naturalization and petitions approved were 35 million for the last 112 years. And that's an 88.74% rate of approval. So you'd say that the rate of approval is quite high. Yes, it is high. But if you're losing 80,000 people every year, that is not very high. So you wouldn't want 80,000 people to be denied citizenship because of their failure in either documentation or their failure in English or civics. So I'd say the consequences are typically not known very well. So I'd like to conclude by saying, in addition to the national story of immigration and citizenship, which probably many people have been fed as a triumphalist and wonderful story, we need to look at the undertold story as well. And the undertold story is the push and the pull, or the willingness to accept new immigrants and the restrictions to accept new immigrants. This has been going on for more than 100 years, maybe 200 years. So it's not a glorious history. The official story of naturalization also looks at just applicants in terms of numbers, so facts and figures of thousands of people. So you get the sense that the official story is a story that's compelling, and is a story that will be the story about immigration and citizenship. But in my view, there is a need for the subaltern story of immigration and immigrants who became naturalized citizens, who are planning to become naturalized citizens, and who are indifferent and may or may not become citizens. And why are these things happening? Why is it that some people are willing to become naturalized citizens? Why is it some people are not willing to be naturalized citizens? In order to probe this question, so we want to ask this question in terms of why are non-English LPRs? And so it looks like non-English LPRs are in greater danger of not becoming citizens because of their lack of English language ability. And so we've got to look at archives, identify trends, and look at digital stories. How useful are the citizenship classes? Well, this is something that we've got to probe in terms of using any one of the techniques that we can, what we have at our disposal, things like classroom observation, discussions with teachers, students, learners, as to the efficacy of the so-called ESL and citizenship classes, which many people take for semester after semester, but their English language ability and history and civics knowledge does not improve significantly, at least anecdotally here in California. And how can we use technology to help the naturalization process? So we have two studies that were conducted 10 years ago. Min investigated the level of political and civic activity among Korean Americans in Los Angeles before taking the test and after taking the test. And the main finding was that there's no statistically significant difference between before taking the test and after taking the test. So it's not as though after the test was taken, the applicants who became citizens became more politically and active and civically active. Their level of activity remained the same. So if they were not active before the test, they were still not active after. If they were active before, they continued to be active. So that's what we found. In terms of reluctance to file applications, this is a very big one. Martinez did find that 25% of the residents in the Los Angeles area among Latinos did not want to apply for citizenship. And it's very curious because we asked many probing questions, and one of the responses from the participants was that, oh, if we fail the test, we may be deported. If we fail the test, someone else said, if we fail the test, maybe we will lose our jobs. So there's a lot of misinformation about the importance of this test. And the test is a massive hurdle for people in Southern California of Latino heritage. They do not trust the government to do the right thing. They feel that if they fail, they will be deported, they lose their jobs, they lose their children, and so on and so forth. So what is it that can be done in the community? The official documents on websites do not say anything about how to assuage their fears. Things like, okay, if you fail the test, it's not a problem, you will not be sent home. This sort of messaging has to be done. And it's also compounded by all these English-only movements in different parts of the country. If you look at from 1981 onwards, except for Hawaii and Alaska, which allow multilingualism, all the other states have passed laws that promote English language only. And this adds to the complication of what is the perception of applicants or immigrants vis-a-vis English. So California is a good example. They passed a proposition 227 in 1998, which was then repealed in 2016. But the 1998 proposition, which was passed, propelled many states to do the same. Arizona was an example, and many other states have passed this. Hawaii continues with English and Hawaiian, and Alaska has 20 languages plus English as official languages. So in conclusion, we have to ask, what are the arguments for and against English only and multilingualism in the United States? What is the official language at the national level, at the state level, and at the provincial level? What are the benefits that go to residents? What rights should immigrants and new citizens have in relation to public language use? Should they have a language of their choice in public services, such as school districts where they get information about their children, driver's licenses, DMV offices, courts in terms of court translation and interpretation services, in terms of taxes and other community services? And how can we compose a fuller story of modern subalterns, immigrants and citizenship seekers and non-seekers? What is their story in terms of why is it that despite all this infrastructure of promoting citizenship for legal permanent residents? Why is it that so many thousands of people don't apply and want to remain residents? This is a story that has to be pursued, and we don't see this story being pursued as part of the official concern of the government. I have a few references from subaltern studies, from some of my own writing on this topic, and a very important topic, very important paper at the end by Gayatri Spivak, who's a university professor at Columbia, who wrote a very influential paper in the Subaltern collection called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" And at the end of her long paper, she concluded, no, that they cannot speak. And what we want to make sure is that they can speak, or they can be heard, or they can be allowed to speak. So I would like to encourage all of you who are looking for research topics to find ways where you can find a voice for subalterns, the immigrants in any part of the world seeking citizenship, to find out what are their concerns. And I think this is an important aspect of understanding the history of immigration and citizenship, a subaltern history. Thank you very much. I'll pause for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Kunin, for that very, very interesting, insightful, and a timely talk. We have about 10 minutes, and we will now move on to our Q&A session. I think first off, we do have a comment about how, from someone, it says, apart from English proficiency, sometimes the candidates have no idea what to say as the stakes are high. They might not feel comfortable answering the questions. And then I myself took a Canadian citizenship test a couple of weeks ago. Some civics questions were not easy to answer as they required critical knowledge of the civics knowledge. Could you speak about that, Dr. Kunin? Even though the pass rate, as you mentioned, might be high, 90%, it is extremely high stakes, right, in terms of what it means for the test takers. So it's quite understandable why some candidates might be extremely nervous, and that can obviously, the anxiety can factor into their actual performance, their test performance, not just on the language aspect, but also on the civics part.
Yeah, I just want to say that in some countries, there's more effort to bring residents into citizenship. In some countries, there's very little information, or inadequate information, or confusing information. Now, I'm aware of the situation in South Korea, where, for example, residents from China are seeking citizenship. And in addition to learning sufficient Korean, they're expected to sing the national anthem. Now, you'd like to know, what is the basis for that? Why should anybody have to be able to sing the national anthem to get citizenship? And what is the quality of singing? What is the quality of knowledge of vocabulary that is required? And who's going to be the judge whether the singing was appropriate? So, there's confusing and perhaps unnecessary issues like that. There are cases where immigration and citizenship is opaque in many countries. People do not know how to get this, even if they want to. So while the United States has made a lot of effort in trying to, make all of this available, at least to my limited extent, it seems it's still insufficient, but there's a lot of effort. In many countries, there is less effort. And part of the confusion is in communicating all the aspects of citizenship getting to residents who would probably like to do it. But if they don't like to do it, if they don't want to apply, then there are probably many reasons, like some of the reasons that I found from the storytellers in California.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say that the official story is always a good one, right? Thousands of people get citizenship. You see this in the local television news, a local mayor or a governor or someone else going and presenting flags and swearing people in. Fine, that's fine. But the undertold story is never told, and the subaltern story is never told.
That's something that we really need to be aware of. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and I'll read the first one from Liberato Silva dos Santos. Where do most people who applied to and were denied US citizenship come from? What are the top 3 to 5 countries where they come from? And then for the sake of comparison, what is the typical English language proficiency level? Is it A1, A2, etc., required of people who apply for citizenship in countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK?
Okay, so the second question first. The level of proficiency varies from country to country. In some countries, for example, they have to take the IELTS general test or the PTE general test, and that would be much lower than in some other countries. But as you've seen in the United States, it's even lower, probably. It's not even a full test. It's a mini test, if you like. But even the mini test seems to come in the way of immigrants who want to become citizens. Now, I saw a question from Ilana also there. Why should people become citizens? Certainly, this is a question that is of importance to ask. Do people want to become citizens after they immigrate? Maybe they don't. And this is it reflects the relationship that they have with their country. It may be a love relationship or a hate relationship or a love-hate relationship that people have in the receiving country because they are not fully received. If they are fully received, in my view, it's likely that they would want to participate in every aspect of governance or every aspect of a community.
Thank you. So the next questions have to do with the validity of the test. We have a question from Shabi, who asks, to what extent are the immigration test construct valid? And I also related question by Young Shin about the fairness of the language test, and when a particular group of test takers outperform others, which is common in many standardized tests, how do we know that it's a matter of a test or some other broader social issues like opportunity to learn?
Yes, this is an excellent question. I mean, but the answer to the question from the point of view of the United States is that we don't know. We don't know anything about the performance on the test because USCIS is not obligated to make that information known. And I tried through the Freedom of Information Act, and it's not possible to get information on US citizenship applications because that's considered private, and you cannot get any group information except the group information that they provide. So what they provide is number of applicants, number of approvals, number of denials. They don't break it down by gender. They don't break it down by nationality or native language group. So we don't have information about any of those. And so this is a problem. And I acknowledge that the question, and we all have questions, but we don't have a way of getting answers. Yes, it may be a hidden agenda. Ilana has always talked about the hidden agenda of tests in many contexts. And this is perhaps the most, a situation or a context that's most amenable to politics or political gaming. So you can have tests, as we have noticed in the UK and Australia, Tests have changed depending on the current government. Tests become easier or tests become more difficult. Tests have certain elements in them, but they are removed and new elements are placed. So questions that require knowledge of culture and tradition are changed from time to time. And so immigration and citizenship is an arm of part of government. And so it's very difficult to move government when they don't make it possible through existing laws or procedures to collect information about it. So the most information you can get is the kind of information that I presented from the Department of Homeland Security. So I recommend that, for viewers from different parts of the world to try and see whether you can get information beyond group statistics, which is what we typically have. And even group statistics may not be available in some countries, to the extent that they're available in some other countries. So we've got to keep trying.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kunin. We have one more question. I don't think we have more time to answer more, but from Donald, not all countries recognize dual citizenship. So becoming a US citizen might require relinquishing citizenship of the country of origin. Some immigrants from such countries may be reluctant to permanently cut all ties. Could this partially explain the differences in time to citizenship?
Yes. So this is a factor for many individuals that I've interviewed myself, that they are reluctant to cut ties with their home country. A good example is Gayatri Spivak herself, who's, as I said, a university professor at Columbia. She's of Indian origin. She's well known in the field of, comparative literature and critical studies and subaltern studies. She has remained an Indian citizen because she says she feels reluctant to become an American citizen, basically to swear and to take the oath of allegiance and to bear arms against other countries if needed. So these are some of the three requirements. And yes, I think a certain percentage of people in a country would be reluctant to give up their previous citizenship. But among the Latinos that we talked to, that was not the primary reason. The primary reason was English language proficiency. They felt their English language proficiency was low, and they couldn't understand all the stuff that was in the books or on TV or in videos. And they were reluctant to go through the process because they felt that what would be the point? We are just going to fail. And they get stories from friends and family members who say, oh, it's very difficult and it's confusing and all of that. So it basically told us that it was, the main reason was English language proficiency. Other reasons included things like cost and procedural delays, considering that they've got to have multiple sets of things to do, and biometric matters and all that adds to the complication. So it's not as it's not as though you can submit one piece of paper and at the end of 3 or 4 months or whatever, you get a call saying, go and take the test and get your citizenship. It's a very convoluted process. And most people even think that they've got to hire an attorney to do it. There's no need, the documents are clear enough, but it's likely that some people may fear that that is also a requirement, an implicit requirement, and that just puts people off. But thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kunin. And that's all the time we have today. Thank you for a very, very interesting, very eye-opening for me, and I'm sure for many of us, on very important topic today regarding immigration and naturalization. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Today's talk will be uploaded in our YouTube channel, and I wish everyone the rest of the year happy holidays, and we'll be back for the spring of 2022. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.